Hello and welcome. It's easy enough to wage war, but is it possible to wage peace? Once fighting starts, it becomes a cycle of mistrust and hate that can last decades, even centuries. So what's the starting point for making peace? Across the globe, dozens of ongoing conflicts continue to rage, resulting in the loss of thousands of lives each year. While most of the world is aware of the wars in places such as Iraq and Afghanistan, smaller conflicts like those in Sri Lanka, Nepal and the Philippines get little attention and even less hope for resolution. For the battles dragging on in places such as the Middle East and Kashmir, there's even less light at the end of the tunnel. So today we ask, does security have to come before talks of peace begin? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. You can send an email or an SMS, and we also welcome your phone calls onto the show. Joining us for the discussion today is a man described as the father of peace studies, Johan Galtung. As well as founding the Peace Research Institute of Oslo, Professor Galtung has held chairs in peace studies and peace research at universities in 3 continents. He's just published 50 Years, 100 Peace and Conflict Perspectives. He's joining me here in Washington, D.C. And from New York is a veteran of the United Nations, Alvaro de Soto. He's been a leading figure in peace negotiations, such as the successful resolution of El Salvador's 10-year civil war. Gentlemen, I welcome you to the show.
Thank you.
Professor, starting with you. Thank you, Ambassador. Now, Professor, considering how most conflicts end up, isn't peace really a relative term? Isn't it a situation where it's more or less just an end to the violence the way people see it now?
Well, it is a relative term like health. You're not going to get perfect health for everybody in the world. But we have the last 2 centuries done much better than we did before. So the question is whether we couldn't do the same for peace. And to me, the general formula in one sentence is identify the underlying conflict and try to solve it. In other words, searching for peace comes before security. You can do this before the violence starts, you can do it during the violence. It's very important.
Interesting, Professor. We had a question from a viewer who touched on your teachings on negative and positive peace. And David Touch wrote in saying, what is the distinction between negative peace and positive peace? And apart from explaining it, give us an honest assessment of how applicable it is in the real world.
Negative peace is absence of violence. So that would be similar to absence of symptoms of a disease, absence of fever, things of that kind. Things that reduce the body and reduce the conviviality, absence of violence. Positive peace is more like the immune system, building a strong body, building strong relations between parties of cooperation and harmony. Example, European Union, positive peace.
Well,
admirable peace, so peace engineering.
Well, Professor, I'm going to see how we apply that in the real world in a moment. Let me bring in Ambassador de Soto here, and good to have you as well, sir. Now, you've been involved in a number of conflicts situations, and I wonder how much do you think principles of impartiality and self-determination in mediation are actually respected by those trying to broker peace?
Well, impartiality is certainly fundamental for international organizations who are in the business of trying to solve conflicts. And that is usually something that must be adhered to profoundly. Self-determination works and is necessary in the context of doing away with colonial regimes, but you have to be careful of not taking it to the point where you're breaking up established states and into 1,000 pieces. You could have otherwise what happened in the former Yugoslavia replicated on a rather giant scale. So you have to. It's a tricky concept to handle.
Now, Ambassador, considering the experiences you've had across the world and the conflicts you've witnessed and seen, I wonder, is there a common thread that you can see in these conflicts which allows you to formulate a procedure or an approach based on your experiences of other places? Or is it that each conflict has to be approached in a totally new way?
I'd say that there are more differences than commonalities between conflict. I certainly adhere to what Dr. Galtung said a moment ago, identify the underlying causes and address them. But other than that, the sad fact in an era where you have a great transparency and the press is focused on efforts to bring about negotiated end to conflicts, you have too high expectations. And unfortunately, not all conflicts lend themselves to the ministrations of conflict resolvers. Timing is everything.
Well, Professor, you know, it's interesting if we look at a situation, a real-world situation with one where certainly the United States has backed itself into a military and political corner, so to speak. I'm talking, of course, about Afghanistan. And I wonder, with things there deteriorating steadily, in spite of the ambitious efforts of the international community, what impact do you expect from President Obama's suggested troop increase?
Very negative. I think I would agree with the ambassador more than with the general. We don't have to mention the names. But again, I think the basic point is to find the underlying conflict. And to my mind, there are two. There is one bunch of items that have to do with Afghanistan. And then there's another one, which is called the US security and the danger of Afghanistan being a failed state and being, if you will, very hospitable to Al-Qaeda. I think one has to go deeper than that, much deeper. And what to me was very inspiring was the Spanish Prime Minister Zapatero's way of handling what in Spanish is called 11M, the 11th of March 2004, where you had this horrible atrocity committed at the Madrid subway station. Well, he pulled out of Iraq. He went to Rabat to negotiate with the king. He didn't bomb Rabat, as somebody else might have done. He certainly, very basically, recognized illegal immigrants, almost 500,000, provided they have a job, and he organized dialogue of civilization with the Turkish Prime Minister. Right. So there you have four excellent things, picking up four components of what is often called terrorism. He could have added an apology for what Spain did in Morocco in 1925, bombing the sacred city of Jaén. And there was a young general called Francisco Franco who administered that. He could have apologized for that. He could also perhaps have offered his services as mediator, but he was not quite that good at the ETA situation. But I think that was brilliant. Now, if Bush and Blair had done something similar, there would have been a much better situation.
Of course, Afghanistan is a tangle, and I wonder, Ambassador De Soto, if I could ask you about the approach that the international community has taken there. I wonder, considering the way things are going, is it, in your opinion, more advisable for the international community to leave the affairs of Afghanistan to the Afghans and essentially pull out?
Well, the case has not yet been made convincingly, as far as I can tell from what I see in the press, for an actual military increase, improving the situation. To the contrary, what worries me with a large military increased commitment is that the West, by and large, lacks what's known as strategic patience. Political calendars interfere, and certainly this particular military endeavor is not popular in either Europe or the United States, as far as I can tell. So it's not clear that if there is an increase, they will be able to actually sustain it until the goals are achieved, which is many years down the road, as far as I can tell.
Ambassador, let's take a look at a situation that's been going on a long time as well, 6 decades, the Middle East. Now, you're known for your strong views on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You've criticized Israel for setting unachievable conditions for talks and the Palestinians for their violence. And you said that American pressure has pummeled into submission the UN's role as an impartial Middle East negotiator. I know that was meant for just UN ears, but it got out. But I want to put a question that came from a viewer on that issue from New York here in the USA. Gregory Beals wrote in saying, what political conditions are necessary for the UN Security Council to accept a declaration of Palestinian independence? How would such a declaration overcome a possible US veto, and under what conditions would it lead to lasting peace with Israel? Can you see any conditions acceptable to the UN Security Council?
Well, you would have to find the creation of a Palestinian state is part and parcel of an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and it holds the key to the solution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, broadly speaking, and it also affects conflict even going broader than that. The problem is bringing about a solution that creates not just a Palestinian state in the abstract, but rather a viable one that can actually stand up on its own 2 feet and that is not entirely dependent on Israel. And that requires a number of problems being solved. Certainly one of them is a security problem, but another one is the ability of the Palestinians, those that are in Gaza, as well as those that are in the West Bank, to be able to have connectivity and to be able to move around freely, to be able, so as to be able to successfully export to the outside world. And a solution also has to be found to the question of Jerusalem, which goes beyond the ability of merely the Palestinians to enter into agreements on. It concerns the entire Muslim world. And there's also the central question of the Palestinian refugees who are languishing already in the third or fourth generation in their hundreds of thousands in neighboring countries.
Right, and on that subject, I was going to ask Professor Galtung exactly this, that the ambassador has listed some of these well-known situations. When the situation seems so intractable as described there, how do you approach it with your view on peace?
You go into the future. You say, I've been mediating there since 1964, hundreds of dialogues. And I agree very, very much with what the ambassador said. I'd just like to add a point. I think the solution is, and you have to almost paint it on the wall, it's a Middle East community. A Middle East community of Israel with the 5 neighboring Arab states, meaning Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Palestine, fully recognized according to international law, 194, 242, all that, and Egypt. And the model is, of course, the European community, as it was born in reality 1st of January 1958, accommodating Germany. This could accommodate Israel. But Israel would be a Jewish state or a state with Jewish characteristics, but it would not realize the more, let us say, extremist Zionist dreams from Nile to the Euphrates or anything like that. It would not accommodate 13.9 million Jews. It would be a state with Jewish characteristics, a normal country, and its security would be through peace, the same way as we have done it in Europe, successfully. And we didn't do it in Europe by having a treaty between Germany and Luxembourg. And this kind of arrangement between Israel and a Palestinian mini-state with 7.5% of the territory is just a way of feeding the future with conflict.
I want to ask you more about it in a second, Professor, but I'm going to ask you and the ambassador to stand by as we take a very short break now. We have more of our discussion in just a moment. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're examining the concept of waging peace, especially in the face of entrenched conflicts such as those in the Middle East. With me, I have Professor Johan Galtung, the founder of the Peace Research Institute of Oslo and a leading figure in conflict studies. He's here in the studio with me. Also, veteran peace negotiator and Peruvian diplomat Alvaro de Soto, who helped to end El Salvador's 10-year civil war. Ambassador de Soto joins us from New York. Let's get back to questions. And actually, Professor, I just want to pick up what you were saying about the Middle East and this idea of creating this area, this region of peace. It doesn't seem anyone would even consider that kind of situation right now, though. It seems that generations
I had the idea first in 1971. A colleague of mine at the University of Cairo, Professor Boutros Ghali, translated it and got it into Arabic and Hebrew. And last year it ended on the first page of Israeli newspapers. Now, such ideas take time. They take time. So let us say I, as an NGO mediator, can only work with relatively compelling ideas. And I noticed that this idea has a tremendous appeal for the younger generation. Maybe it's an age question. So I have an image that within 20 years, 15 years, maybe 10 years, a young person comes up in Israel, not the general, maybe a woman, maybe a lady, saying, I don't think the Zionist expansion as a perennial program for Israel is a starter. Maybe it never was. A Jewish state is a starter, and it never was. I go for that one. And I go for an open community without borders with our neighboring countries. Free flow of goods and services, settlement and investment could be a little bit more problematic. That could come later. And then regimes. And here I must say, very impressive the work that the European Union has done in making a model that can be copied.
Now, it's interesting. I want to get back to Ambassador de Soto in New York and ask, considering what you said about the role of the United Nations and the way it's been affected by American policy, I wonder, do you feel the international community still has a role to play in the conflict in the Middle East there, or will it always be subjugated to pressure from America?
Well, I think that the most important role has to be played by the United States. And actually, I held out a lot of hope on the basis of what President Obama said when he was a candidate and certain steps that he took afterward. He clearly has an inclusive approach to the solution of international problem. He has demonstrated this in holding out a hand and in hoping that fists will be unclenched in exchange in the case of Iran, in the case of Burma or Myanmar, in the case of Sudan, in the case of Syria. Inclusivity, I think, is crucial, and I hope that that will be followed up by Senator Mitchell, who practiced precisely such an approach in a very imaginative way on the conflict of Northern Ireland. Part of the problem in the case of the Middle East is that the Palestinians themselves are rent apart. And it seems to me that the idea of reaching an Israeli-Palestinian agreement while excluding Hamas, which at the last elections got the majority of the voting public, is a non-starter. The Palestinians have to come back together. And Israel has its own internal problems. Dr. Galtung's dream of a prime minister with a totally different approach, perhaps in another generation, is all very well because of the fact that the Zionist project of bringing all Jews back to Israel has not really succeeded, and they are not able to carry out that dream fully. And also the internal political problems that are due to the political system in Israel, where you have prime ministers who have this epiphany and realize that they have to have a two-state solution very soon, or otherwise lose the democratic part of the Jewish and democratic state, and yet are unable to do anything about it because of a political system that won't allow it to. Right. That's a problem that also needs to be addressed. I'm not so sure how it's going to be addressed.
I wonder, Professor, with listening to that again, what the ambassadors had to say, of course, Hamas, an excluded party, and I guess a major integral part of what would be needed in terms of talks. And also, how do you regard what Judge Goldstone had to say and how his report was received?
Well, let me first say that in my dialogues, I have, of course, had dialogues with Hamas and Hezbollah, with top people in Israel, with everybody. So for me, as an NGO person, I have the advantage that I can approach anybody I want, and they can approach me. So that is not a problem. And I found Hamas very clearly emphasizing that there is a Jewish state we can recognize. And when I asked, is that close to 4 June 1967? They said, well, there are a couple of points, and if you don't mind, we won't reveal our political agenda on that one, but in that direction. I find that important. And absolutely no reason why they should not be accepted as a legitimate partner. But I would like to, in a sense, pick up one point here that seems to me to be important. The ambassador's approach I respect very much. It is trying to do the best under the present circumstances. It in no way excludes at the same time having an image of the future. In 1995, I was invited to mediate between Peru and Ecuador. They were fighting a war which had lasted 54 years, quite a lot of time, thousands killed, an atrocious war. And the problem was, how do we draw the border for the contested zone? And I said, Su Excellencia, maybe you shouldn't draw a border. Maybe you should have a binational zone, maybe with a natural park.
That's your peace part, yeah.
Precisely. Okay, 3 years later that happened. So I projected an image on the wall. And it was rejected by the person with whom I first presented it. I'll not mention who it was. That's not that's within my professionalism not to do it, but very high up. And he said, very creative, but too creative. Now, for the younger generation in the presidency, it was not too creative, so it took 3 years.
Could Jerusalem have that kind of model, for example?
Yes. I think that kind of model is important. You find a cooperative project. It is impartial in the sense it's equitable between the parties. An Ecuadorian told me, I want to be hiking up in that zone. Will I meet Peruvians? And I said, yes, you'll meet Peruvians. I don't like Peruvians. And I said, maybe you can have 500 meters each. You have from 4,000 to 4,500. He from 4,500 to 5,000. He said, but that's ridiculous. I can take it. And so it went. You see, I would be optimistic, and I have actually quite a few cases in this book. But I would like to say a warning. A success can turn into a failure, and a failure can turn into a success. The world is dynamic. Things happen. I would like to come back to Afghanistan with a concrete image.
Quick thought.
Is it okay?
Please.
Quick. I think the basic point is to recognize Taliban as member of a coalition government, having the moral fiber of the country. And the opposite is heroin and, of course, corruption. Point two, that Afghanistan will have to find its way towards a federation. It cannot be run from Kabul. Point three, it has to relate to neighboring countries, because they are in Afghanistan, Afghanistan them, Tajiks in Tajikistan, Dari speaking in Iran, and so on. We get a kind of Central Asian Islamic community of maybe 8 parts if you count the Pakistani part of Kashmir. Point four, a basic needs-oriented policy, and last point, a security policy based on cooperation between the Security Council and the Organization of the Islamic Conference. This seems to me entirely feasible, and a much better road than a ridiculous, stupid war which has no chance at all, and which will end in a way we know, namely the Vietnam way.
Well, Professor, unfortunately, we've got so many more questions, Myanmar, Cyprus, and so on, but I have to thank you and the Ambassador for taking part, and hope we'll get you both back again soon. Thank you.
Thanks to you.
Thank you for being with us. Remember, you can follow the show on Facebook and see what we're up to there. You can give us your feedback on the show and post your questions and comments. On the next show, tensions across the Taiwan Strait. Are warming relations between Beijing and Taipei a threat to Taiwanese sovereignty? And would US military sales to Taiwan upset the balance of power in the region? Make sure you tune in for that. From me and the team, see you next time.